In the small town of Ensley, Michigan, with a population of just 2,500 people, a horrific crime unfolded at a house on a quiet dead-end street. For a time, the police struggled to connect the numerous pieces of evidence, but an unexpected witness, who remembered the victim's final words with chilling accuracy, helped them crack the case. This is the story of how investigators unraveled a bloody murder and found justice in the most unforeseen way. Martin Durham was born in 1969 in Grand Traverse County, Michigan. He grew up with his siblings in the countryside, where his parents owned a home. Martin was a typical kid living in a good environment, surrounded by natural beauty. It's no surprise that as a boy, he fell in love with fishing and hiking, capturing his adventures with vivid photographs. He would often grab his tent and backpack to spend a few days in the great outdoors, usually accompanied by his older cousin. They formed a close bond that would last a lifetime. At 17, Martin met his first love, a girl named Glenna Johnson. She was a year older than him. They lived in the same neighborhood and attended the same school. However, their idyllic romance was short-lived, and they quickly broke up. But something kept pulling them back together, perhaps the intensity of their first feelings. They would get back together, only to part ways again after a short time. This pattern repeated itself multiple times. They had so much in common that the young lovers couldn't stay away from each other for long. Perhaps it was because they loved the same things and shared the same hobbies. Despite this common ground, they eventually decided to split for good and go their separate ways. For a long time, the former sweethearts didn't see or speak to each other. In the meantime, Martin met another woman and fell for her instantly. Her name was Christine Keller. They hit it off immediately and soon moved in together. After a short period of dating, Martin decided she was the one and that they should make it official. In 1989, Martin and Christine got married. The newlyweds moved into their own home, a gift from their parents, located in a quiet residential area of the city. In the following years, they had 2 sons and a daughter. His wife took care of the house and children while Martin worked to support the family. In addition to his main job repairing cars, he also worked part-time at a small local restaurant for many years. Overall, his work brought in a good income, enough for them to live on. Despite this, the first years of their marriage were quite difficult. This was particularly due to their children being born close in age. The young parents were overwhelmed with the responsibilities of caring for their little ones. They slept little and were often exhausted, which led to frequent arguments. But they were determined to overcome every challenge. Martin was a good father and did everything in his power to get his family on its feet. Many considered him a role model. Unfortunately, this couldn't save him from tragedy. In March 1995, disaster struck the family. A truck ran a red light and slammed into Martin's car. The truck dragged his vehicle across the pavement, literally crushing it with him inside. As a result of this traffic accident, our hero sustained extremely serious injuries. He suffered broken ribs, a fractured jaw, and broken legs, as well as a severe traumatic brain injury. An extensive area of his brain was severely damaged. Doctors fought for Martin's life with all their might, but he fell into a coma where he remained for several months. During this period, he underwent multiple surgeries and barely pulled through. However, his struggles were just beginning. Returning to a normal life required a very long and arduous recovery. Martin had to relearn how to sit up and hold his head, not to mention more complex movements. He was literally forced to master his own body all over again. The accident had disfigured his face. His brain had lost some of its functions, but Martin kept fighting to become himself again and return to a normal life with his family. He spent a long time in a wheelchair before moving on to crutches. Although he was gradually overcoming the physical consequences of the accident, the psychological damage was profound. Martin was a broken man. He could no longer work as a car mechanic or provide for his family, and he faced a mountain of physical limitations that turned his world upside down. The heaviest blow for him was the inability to lead the active lifestyle he once cherished. He adored camping, fishing, and hiking, but now he was confined to his bed in his home. Every movement was a struggle, accompanied by pain that only the strongest painkillers could manage. According to his doctors, these consequences would haunt him for the rest of his life. However, this period was difficult not only for Martin, but for his loved ones as well. Where his wife Christine had previously only managed the children and the household, she now had to bear the financial burden of their lives. She was forced to put the children in daycare and get a job to support the family. She also had to care for her ailing husband. Fortunately, close relatives helped her, and with their support, the woman managed to cope with all the difficulties. But those weren't all the problems. Christine recounted that her husband had become aggressive and often displayed hostility towards her, lashing out at her. Furthermore, he began to suffer from memory lapses. Martin couldn't remember much of his past, including events from their family life. There were times when he couldn't even recall his children's names. Many friends and acquaintances he had known for decades became strangers to him. This plunged him into a state of isolation, as he couldn't communicate properly with people due to massive memory gaps, concentration problems, and mental confusion. All of this made him cold and dismissive. Martin spent most of his time lost in his own thoughts, which he shared with no one. At the same time, he continued treatment for the injuries he had sustained. For this, he regularly attended physical therapy and sometimes stayed in the hospital for treatment, changing doctors several times in the process. Fortunately, this gradually began to yield results. Martin's physical condition improved significantly, but he was still haunted by the psychological aftermath of the horror he had endured. His wife remembered this period with pain, thinking about how hard it must have been for Martin. He had always been very precise and meticulous, especially with financial matters. Now, he literally couldn't count his own money. At the same time, he constantly tried to control their spending, criticizing his wife's approach, which only increased the tension between them. It was an incredibly difficult period in the young family's life. The head of the household continued to fight his injuries and psychological problems with all his might, but his inability to overcome some of them filled him with anger. He would easily snap at his wife, and it was almost always undeserved. Christine tried her best to be understanding and accept the changes in her husband's character, but eventually, her patience ran out. 2 years after the accident, she filed for divorce. Christine later admitted that she hadn't wanted to do it, but Martin had become simply unbearable. The divorce was a huge blow to the man. He felt hurt and disappointed for a long time. Because of Christine's decision to leave, she moved out of their home with the children, and Martin was left in the care of his parents, who visited him. Nevertheless, he had to move on. He wasn't want to give up or stop trying. Martin received a large insurance settlement for the accident, which he used to buy another house. He also received monthly disability payments from the agency, which were paid throughout his recovery period. All of this allowed him to stay afloat and support himself. Our hero moved into his new home with their shared parrot. Christine loved the animal very much, but left the pet with her ex-husband as a companion, so he wouldn't be bored and lonely. The bird was quite old, but provided Martin with company. The pet was a 15-year-old African gray parrot named Bud. So, Martin found himself in this modest company in a small house located in Sand Lake, about 30 kilometers from his old home. Martin had big plans. He wanted to recover as quickly as possible, get back on his feet, and return to a normal life for the sake of his children. The man quickly settled into his new place and regularly communicated with his children. Even his relationship with his ex-wife improved. She noted that he finally had a renewed interest in life and a goal: to make a full recovery. Here, he started a garden in his backyard. Martin designed it himself and took care of its upkeep. The man truly had a talent for it, and his neighbors quickly took notice. They began to approach him more and more often to design their private gardens and for lawn care services. This effectively gave Martin a job, an additional income, and the confidence that he could handle whatever life threw at him. All of this had a very positive effect on his condition. During this period, doctors noted a steady improvement. Of course, the progress was gradual, but the trend was clearly positive. However, despite the significant improvements in Martin's condition and mood, his ex-wife was in no hurry to return to him, fearing that he would relax and the old problems would resurface. So, she watched his progress from a distance, maintained contact, and brought the children to visit. In '97, Martin, tired of being alone, reconnected with his first love. Coincidentally, Glenna Johnson had also recently divorced her husband. They started talking, and old feelings for each other reignited with new force. His former girlfriend started visiting Martin more often, and a romance blossomed between them. Later, she moved in with him for good. Her children remained with her ex-husband, but she regularly had them over. Martin's children also came to visit sometimes. During those times, their life was quite dynamic and full. But most of the time, it was just the two of them at home. This allowed the couple to engage in their favorite activities like fishing, hunting, and hiking. Glenna helped Martin cope with his physical limitations during these outings. However, it was difficult, so they more often took walks around the neighborhood or visited the casino they had loved in their youth. These trips to the casino became a small ritual. Once a month, they would go and test their luck. The couple became popular in the local community. They often gathered friends and acquaintances for poker games, hosted barbecues in their backyard, and generally formed a very harmonious union. It seemed they had found each other again and were happy together. In the summer of 2005, they decided to get married. Everything seemed perfect, but their closest friends knew that behind the facade of this ideal relationship, something else was lurking. After the accident, as we know, Martin had changed. He had become harsher and more demanding, which led to periodic conflicts in the relationship. He wanted to control his partner by any means necessary and hated it when she did things without him or left him alone to run errands. Martin also demanded complete control over the financial side of their relationship, which also caused some problems. His wife tried to manage the family finances on her own, but Martin suspected she wasn't being entirely honest and was spending a lot of money on unnecessary things. At that time, he was still receiving disability benefits, and his wife had become his official caregiver, but she had one weakness. The woman was a gambling addict and spent a lot of money on games of chance. Glenna visited the casino much more often than her husband, without his knowledge. She was a regular there and lost a lot of money. Furthermore, there were obvious problems between Glenna and Martin's ex-wife, Christine. Apparently, Martin had repeatedly complained about his ex-wife, saying she abandoned him during the difficult period after his accident, failing to consider that he had made Christine's life unbearable. His ex-wife had put up with him for 2 years and simply couldn't take it anymore, but she continued to support him as best she could, communicating with him and bringing the children. However, Martin didn't mince words when speaking negatively about Christine to his new wife, and these sentiments were passed on to Glenna. It's known that she also didn't choose her words carefully and often expressed her discontent to her husband's children. Naturally, they told their mother about it, and it got to the point where the sons and daughter no longer wanted to visit their father as long as his new wife was there. They didn't like hearing nasty things about their mother. Christine supported their decision and stopped bringing the children to their father's house. Martin was angry at his ex-wife and constantly argued with her. Against this backdrop, tension also arose with Glenna's children. Overall, relationships on this level began to deteriorate, and the behavior of all parties only worsened the situation. It's worth noting one small detail that might reveal the second wife's true feelings for Martin. On the back of her hand, she had a tattoo of his name, which she had gotten when she was 18, back when they were first dating. She never removed it, likely because of the strong feelings she had harbored all those years. For 15 years, she had held on to the love for her first boyfriend, waiting for the moment they would be together again. However, the reality of their relationship was far from romantic. Disputes, especially over money, arose frequently. This was due to Martin's suspicions that his new wife was spending far more than she earned. Because of this, she was accumulating debt. To cope with her financial difficulties, she repeatedly took money from her husband without his knowledge. Gradually, she took full control of the family's finances, which only heightened the tension. Glenna began using the insurance checks that came to Martin monthly as disability payments. It was also known that the woman was selling the strong, prescription-only painkillers that Martin took. It's known that the accident victim didn't use them regularly, likely leaving him with a large surplus. His wife was selling the medication on the side. Martin's exact role in this activity remains unknown. It's possible he wasn't against the sales. Later, opinions on this matter were divided. Some claimed that Martin himself had been running this small illegal business of selling painkillers since he began his recovery from the accident. This allowed him to earn the extra income he desperately needed without a job. But there were also opponents of this theory who argued that Glenna was simply taking the leftover medication without his knowledge and selling it, taking advantage of her husband's memory loss. Despite all these undercurrents, the toxic relationship between the partners continued for over 11 years. By 2015, they behaved amicably and were still constantly together, but they no longer hid the fact that their marriage was falling apart. Periodically, their dissatisfaction erupted into arguments, which were happening more and more frequently. Later, a friend of the Durhams recounted that he had personally witnessed one of their quarrels, during which Martin's wife threatened to kill him. However, most of the time, they continued to play the role of the perfect couple, walking together hand in hand, just as they had at the beginning of their relationship in their youth. Nevertheless, by May 2015, the question of divorce had become a serious consideration. One morning in May 2015, Martin's ex-wife, Christine, discovered that Martin was selling his house. Christine found a listing on an auction website. She was very surprised and immediately called him. She asked why he had suddenly decided to get rid of his property and put it up for auction, especially since he loved his new home so much, where he had created his garden and lovingly improved it. Martin was in shock. He had no intention of selling anything. He confronted his wife about it. Glenna said it must be a mistake and that she would take care of it. But it was known that she never returned to the issue, leaving the house listing on the website. Previously, their car had been repossessed for debts, but even then, Glenna had assured her husband it was some kind of error and that she would fix it. In the end, nothing changed. The auction for the house was scheduled for 3 weeks later, at the end of the month. This was likely due to the large debts she had accumulated during their marriage. Glenna wanted to sell the house to pay off her debts, and she didn't want to tell Martin about it. She kept this information a secret from everyone. On May 13th, 2015, one of Martin's neighbors came to his house early in the morning and knocked, wanting to discuss a few things with the homeowner. He was surprised when no one responded to his visit or opened the door, as Martin was usually awake at this time. He would either be in the garage or in his garden, doing chores, but on this day, he was nowhere to be seen. Glenna was also usually up and about, handling household matters. The man walked around the house, looking for its inhabitants. The garage was locked, but the front door of the house was unlocked. The neighbor went inside and called out for Martin and his wife, but no one answered. The uninvited guest walked a little further and understood why no one was opening the door when he reached the couple's bedroom. There, the head of the household lay on the floor in a pool of his own blood, and next to him lay his wife, 47-year-old Glenna, with heavy bleeding from her head. The neighbor was terrified, thinking the perpetrator might still be nearby. He ran out of the house and immediately called 911. When the ambulance arrived at the tragic scene, they realized there was nothing they could do for the man. Martin was lying on his side in his underwear, his body already cold. Medics pronounced 46-year-old Martin dead, having passed away several hours before the call. However, his wife was still alive and even conscious, trying to say something. She was muttering fragmented phrases that no one could understand. The woman lay next to her husband, fully clothed. Glenna couldn't provide any useful information about what had happened. She was rushed to the hospital for emergency medical care. Simultaneously, detectives began their investigation. A total of 6 bullets had been fired at Martin and Glenna. The man died instantly, having been hit by 5 of them. His wife had a traumatic brain injury. A bullet had pierced her skull on a trajectory that missed her brain. Therefore, her injuries were not life-threatening. The survivor recovered quickly after surgery at the clinic. Detectives were able to visit her soon after to question her about the incident, but while she was receiving treatment, they had plenty of other work to do. Investigators tried to reconstruct the timeline of events by carefully examining the crime scene. Overall, the scene did not look like a robbery, as no valuables or personal belongings of the Durhams were missing. Even money left in plain sight had not been touched by the perpetrator. Furthermore, neither the doors nor the windows had been forced, which meant the victims might have known their attacker and let them inside. During this time, the police learned about the man's use of strong painkillers and his trade in them, leading to the theory that the prescription drugs could have been the motive for the attack. The full scheme of the medication sales was uncovered. Detectives believed a conflict with buyers might have occurred during a transaction. However, by this point, forensic specialists had already examined and analyzed the crime scene, including the bullets and the weapon found in the house. The pistol was later confirmed to be the murder weapon. In fact, the pistol had belonged to Martin Durham himself for many years, but both of them had been shot with this very weapon. This meant the attacker would have had to enter the house, take the gun, meaning they knew where it was, then likewise take the ammunition, load it, and only then start shooting. This scenario seemed too complicated and therefore improbable. Furthermore, a more thorough search of the bathroom revealed Martin's painkillers, which had not been stolen from the house. This ruled out the theory of a drug sale gone wrong. The weapon used to kill Martin was found under the sofa in the living room. There was an excessive amount of blood in this area, which didn't match the location where the bodies were discovered. It was clear that an attack and shooting had also occurred in the living room, and the execution continued in the bedroom. The man could have been shot in the living room and his body moved later. But why would anyone do that? It felt as if it was done deliberately, likely in an attempt to stage the crime scene and confuse the investigation. This suspicion was confirmed when another spent shell casing was found in the living room, meaning a shot was definitely fired there. The further the investigation progressed, the more questions arose. Blood from different rooms was sent for analysis, which yielded surprising results. The analysis established that all the shots that hit Martin were indeed fired in the bedroom. His blood was not in the living room, nor were there any signs of his body being dragged. The blood in the living room belonged exclusively to Glenna, who was nevertheless found in the bedroom. The bullet, whose casing was found in the living room, had hit the woman in the head, confirming this theory. But how could she have made it to the bedroom after such a wound? Medical experts informed the police that this was indeed possible, as the woman's injury turned out to be far less serious than one might expect. She could have reached the bedroom on her own, especially given that she was conscious when discovered. Nevertheless, it all seemed strange. From this point on, the police began to suspect that it was the victim's wife who had opened fire, shot her husband, and then wounded herself to clear her name of suspicion. However, all these hypotheses needed physical evidence. At this point, law enforcement officers still couldn't question the survivor. She was undergoing treatment and recovering in the hospital, so they took her mobile phone for examination. Thanks to this, detectives learned that the family was in a serious financial crisis due to the woman's actions. Just a day before her husband's death, she had been actively Googling how to use a Ruger P-Series pistol, the very one used to kill her husband and wound her in the head. The police discovered 2 farewell letters in the house, in which Glenna apologized to her children for what she was about to do. She also said goodbye to everyone, as she planned to take her own life. All of this pointed to her as the culprit. However, forensic analysis showed that no fingerprints were found on the murder weapon. Not the victim's, not his wife's, none at all. It had been carefully wiped clean by the perpetrator. Based on all the collected facts, the investigation reconstructed an approximate picture of that fateful day. According to detectives, under the weight of financial problems, Glenna decided to take her own life, but something compelled her to shoot her husband first. He was killed first in the bedroom, and then the woman shot herself in the head, but in the living room. However, she did not die instantly, unlike Martin, and therefore managed to make it to the marital bedroom. All of this could be confirmed or refuted by talking to the survivor, so the police waited for the opportunity to speak with her. They also continued to search for evidence against Glenna. By this time, the victim's family was already convinced that they had not been attacked by a stranger. It was Martin's own wife who had opened fire. Christine Keller, the murdered man's ex-wife, was shocked by what had happened. Although she had never thought highly of Glenna, especially because of her aggressive behavior, she never imagined that this woman was capable of picking up a weapon and committing a crime. Overall, she had seemed harmless. In any case, Christine took her old parrot home to her children. Meanwhile, detectives were able to speak with Glenna for the first time in the hospital, as she had undergone surgery, was conscious, and feeling well. Doctors confirmed that she understood what was happening around her and was ready to listen to the detectives. Despite the positive assessment from the medics, when asked by investigators, she claimed she remembered nothing. According to her, Glenna had never written any farewell letters and had no intention of killing herself, let alone her husband. The police officers were suspicious of the fact that Glenna flatly denied any involvement in the attack on her husband, but also claimed not to remember what happened on that tragic day. This inconsistency seemed suspicious and pointed to her as the probable perpetrator. But at that moment, they could do nothing. The detectives simply didn't have enough solid evidence against her. Several more months passed before she was discharged and went home. The investigation still lacked sufficient evidence, and the police feared that Glenna's complete denial of guilt and her injury would convince a jury of her innocence. Confirmation of their bloody suspicions came from a most unexpected place. One night, as Christine was sleeping in her home, she was awakened by the parrot talking on the first floor. The woman went downstairs to check on the bird and was so shocked by what she heard it saying that she decided to record the bird's monologue on video. She took out her mobile phone and started filming. The pet repeated the same phrase over and over again. "Don't fing shoot," he said, mimicking the voice of his murdered owner. This caused shock and fear. For some time after, the woman was even plagued by nightmares. Christine immediately called and told the police about it, later showing them the video recording. Naturally, using a bird as a witness in a court proceeding was unheard of. But from that moment on, any doubts the detectives had about the involvement of the woman who survived a gunshot to the head were eliminated. The new details of the case sparked great interest from the public and the media. Meanwhile, the investigation continued, and the case was back in the spotlight later. In June 2016, when police arrested Glenna and charged her with first-degree murder based on the totality of the evidence. For the several months leading up to this event, detectives had been piecing together the puzzle of evidence in the case. They formed a compelling picture that was intended to definitively prove to a jury who the killer was and allow the Durham family to get justice. Initially, it was assumed that the incriminating video of the pet would not be used. As it might seem too provocative, it was unknown how the jury would perceive it. The prosecutor argued that Glenna was in a dire financial situation. She couldn't admit her gambling failures to her husband. For a long time before the murder, the defendant had not been paying bills, as all the money went to the debts she had accumulated due to her gambling addiction. Ultimately, she decided to take her own life, which is why she wrote 2 letters. One was addressed to her husband, and the second to her children. This implied that Glenna initially did not intend to execute her lover, but something went wrong. The last straw was the failed sale of the family home, which was put up for auction without her husband's knowledge. When Martin found out about it from Christine, he likely started pressuring his wife. A fight could have broken out, which is why she decided to kill the man in a fit of rage before turning the gun on herself. But Glenna and her lawyer insisted that she remembered nothing, not the shooting, not the letters. According to her, the defendant loved her husband so much that she could never have killed him. As proof of her poor condition, a whole list of medications she was taking to restore her cognitive functions was provided. The defendant denied making the search queries on her phone about the weapon. She claimed she only used the device for games and calls. The trial lasted 10 days. The prosecution believed it had built a solid case that would convince the jury. However, at one point, it seemed the jurors were wavering due to the circumstantial nature of the evidence. Then, as a decisive argument, the video recording of the parrot's words was shown. Experts testified, explaining that parrots form very strong bonds with their owners and mimic the people around them. Most experts agreed that Bud's words were an imitation of his owner's last words, spoken as he was being killed before the bird's very eyes. This made a strong impression on the bird, and the words were imprinted in the parrot's memory, which is why he constantly repeated them. In the end, it worked. After 8 hours of deliberation, the jury found 49-year-old Glenna guilty of first-degree murder. She was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The defendant was enraged by the verdict and denied her guilt. The woman was outraged at how the jury could believe the words of an animal. To this day, Glenna remains in a state prison, never having confessed. The parrot lived for a long time with his new owner, holding the grim secret of the Durham family in his memory. Of course, he didn't solve the crime, but he became a crucial argument for justice. If you like my work, please subscribe to the channel, support this video with a like, and let's discuss this story in the comments. I also recommend watching these videos. Thanks, everyone, and see you next time.